Thank you, Hanan. I think the philosopher, I won't detract because to come to some questions, but to my mind, the philosopher that you've mentioned there, most important for, certainly for my own work, is the Enlightenment context, but in modern times, that of Isaiah Berlin. My task today is less of an argument, but to sketch out the interface of two disciplines. And I want to contextualize that, first of all, in the setting of my own work. So I'm going to put the screen, I think we can see this. So Esther, thank you very much for that introduction. And really, I want to outline the interface of these two in the relation to the conference theme. And thank you very much for the invitation to present today. And it's nice to see so many friends and colleagues here. The interface between peace education and security studies. And I want to look at the origins, that's the beginnings of these two areas as disciplines, their ends or purposes. And I want to identify the fact that actually they're dealing with similar sorts of questions, existential questions, which I name provocatively perhaps apocalypse, but I do not think, particularly given our own present circumstance in the pandemic, stating these things. So Esther identified some of my own background. I just want to also credit some other of the universities where I conjointly hold professorships at Newcastle in Australia, Northwest University in South Africa, and the Irish Institute for Catholic Studies in Ireland, and also my work as Honorary Senior Research Fellow at the University of Birmingham. Now, my work is, as many of you will know, is rooted really across disciplines. The arts and humanities with education and the social sciences. And so what I've got to say today has helped me, I think, to identify this interface between peace education, peace and security studies. And I'll explain where this comes into things. But it's been important for me, this and beneficial, this interdisciplinary interface. So I identify my own contributions, and I want to contextualize what I'm going to say today in this setting. These are four areas where I've made some modest contributions to knowledge. First of all, overlapping or cognate with what Hanan has said, the epistemological foundations of post-Enlightenment religious education. I've dealt specifically with the political and security aspects of religion in education, but I've also branched out improper to the discipline of security and intelligence studies, particularly where it hits a relation to universities, but also schools. And also, I think there's much to be said about the literary context here. And I'm going to draw on some aspects of the counterculture, particularly from the 1960s, which is relevant to our current debates. So those of you that are familiar with my work, particularly the book on the right, deals with many of the foundations, the post-Enlightenment foundations of religion in education. And I won't detail those now, many of you are familiar with them. But I want to highlight partly what Hanan said, but also to emphasize that these are conflictual. I mean, Hanan mentioned Kant and Hegel, but within an educational context and within religious education, there is severe conflict really between these notions, these secular humanistic notions and religious notions. And I've identified that in a number of papers. And I'll give some examples here, particularly on the secularization and securitization of the sacred, and responding to debates between myself and Jackson, which you'll also be familiar with. So the religious and the secular. In research terms, of course, this is also about paradigm shift within religious education, and that's led also to some heated debates within the field. To the left there is that very important, most cited book on social sciences by Thomas Kuhn, and I found that book very useful. Some, of course, have contested my use of the paradigm in the context of religion and education to show the way it's shifting. But I do stand my ground there to show that religion in education has undergone some major shifts over the past decades. And many of those conflicts are political, between the relationship between religion and the state. My colleague Joseph Perdue and I, 2018, published a book, State Religious Education and the State of the Religious Life. Now, my work in security studies proper has identified the relationship between education, security, and intelligence studies. And in 2019, just a year ago this October, I published a 250,000-word book on the specific relationship between universities, security, and intelligence studies as disciplines. Now, where does this all come from? From a person working in religion and education? Well, it derives directly from my work on the political and security aspects of religion in education, particularly in terrorism and counterterrorism, which has accentuated the role of religion in education and the role of religion in society. I also, we can skip over this a bit, but in terms of my own literary background, I have a doctorate in English literature. I've looked at the literary components of this. Now, this literary component, literary theory, strongly correlates to post-colonial theory. So we see that many of the conflicts today, particularly in the Black Lives Matter, have their historical origins in the academic discipline is known as post-colonial theory. Now, I've edited, just being published now, the lead guest editor with our team on post-colonial theory and religious education. So getting onto this particular theme, we see that I want to argue that the respective origins of peace education, central focus of this conference, has a parallel origin in the beginnings of security studies. These are two academic disciplines. They're also important in activist terms, but they have, I say, they run in parallel. Now, I'm not drawing any conclusions today in this short presentation, but I do want to highlight to you all that there is a conjoining of their origins, and they're addressed to similar sorts of apocalyptic ends, a problem really in human life, which is fundamentally existential. Now, I'll briefly outline for you, for those not aware of what is called security studies, securitization theory in particular, and I'll just summarize this, often known as the Copenhagen School. And you'll notice on the right-hand set of notes, Barry Bozana, Allweaver, and others, their notion of securitization emerged from the Conflict and Peace, the Peace Research Institute in Copenhagen in the 1990s. And that's long after, decades after actually the beginning of peace education in other contexts. Their argument, in short, in the books that I've listed here, is simply put here. Their argument is that security as a notion, and if you look at the education policies in each of your states, in each of your nations, or across the European Union, or across the United States, they identified 5 major areas: military, political, societal, economic, and environmental. Pre 9/11, they added religion as one of the major components of securitization theory. Now, they don't like the move of securitization theory. They're more on the peace education side, but they have become a dominant theoretical perspective within the area of security studies and have directly impacted international relations. The next few slides I can actually skip through briefly, which gives you a wide range of the literature that's available in this field. But those 6 areas are where security has really, they regard it as an infiltration of society to all aspects of it. These are some of the major texts which identify this evolution of international security studies. Now, my friend Locke Johnson, a great man, American, a lot of involvement in American state agencies and bringing many of them to account. This Oxford Handbook of National Security Intelligence is probably one of the most important books within this field. We get shorter guides, of course, which shows about the subject of international security never being out to the headlines, the subjects of war and peace, etc., being very, very prominent. I've looked at this work with my colleague in US military intelligence for the research implications in universities of this incursion of security into academic life. So we've got academic disciplines, but we've also got the notion of security, making incursions into all of our lives, into all of our universities, into schools. Scott Parsons and I have identified and outlined the implications of this in a paper called Research Ethics in the Securitized University. I've also identified the implications of this in terms of ethics and epistemology in a paper published earlier this year called The Kill Chain. And I can explain the origins of that term if there are any questions on that. But these do relate to questions of life and death, as I shall explain. Now, so we see the origins of peace education back to the 1960s, Allwever and the Copenhagen School emerging in the 1990s, but they're dealing with similar sorts of origins, and mostly within the United States, the civil rights movement, the peace movement there, in America in particular, in the United States in particular, but also internationally, and in the Cold War era. Now, the Cold War era dealt directly with an apocalyptic scenario. Only remember, please, everybody, remember the 1960s is only 2 decades. It's like Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It's the atomic age. It's as if the atom bombs, first atom bombs and nuclear atom bombs went off only in the year 2000. It's real history. But of course, the impetus of this is the deferred Cold War, the proxy Cold War, which was happening then in Vietnam. And for those of a certain generation amongst us, we will remember, and if we had time, I would indulge and play some of these clips. But there's important context here in peace education outside of the academic context, where we see a confluence. Remember, this is only 45, 55, 65, 60, the mid-60s. It's 2 decades only after. And it's the Vietnam War era. That also coincides two decades only from in America, from 1947, from the formation of the CIA. The countercultural movement is an important element, I think, to the origin and backdrop to what I've actually want to outline today in terms of the identification of this similar origins, similar ends, but different approaches to this one apocalyptic end or issue, the existential crisis. Now, when we look at the question of security, we can also think, we're a conference here on religions and peace. We can think really, it's all post 9/11. And of course, post 9/11 is an important point in international security. It's when security budgets enhanced, when security and particularly counterterrorism permeated all disciplines. I've written extensively on this. But I highlight in this paper, Campus Conspiracies, from Kent State to Counterterrorism, how the origins of this notion about security and counterterror actually have their origins much earlier than 9/11, much earlier than 9/11, and they go back to the counterculture of the 1960s. For those of you who are not aware, I would recommend you just have a look at this song. It's the only paper where I've referenced a popular piece of music. Now, Kent State happened in May 1970, when unarmed students were fired upon by the National Guard. 4 students died. That event would be buried within history if Neil Young and Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young had not, in June 1970, written this song called Ohio, which opens 4 Dead in Ohio. And I detail the importance of that in the Nixon era in this paper, From Kent State to Counterterrorism, to show, as the Copenhagen School does, that security has imbued our universities, our schools, our societies over this period. The song from which this paper derives, again, for those of us of a certain generation, I was born in 1962, so I wasn't exactly tuned into this now, and I think I've put much of this music behind me. But I think this 19-year-old young man, Barry Maguire, wrote this very, very powerful song in 1967, 1968. and it became an iconic song. And this is where I derive the title of this paper, because I do not think that the topics that we are talking about are merely matters of intellectual or academic abstraction. I mean, we are in the midst of a pandemic, but the nuclear context with which I've referenced is still really part of our political life. And the questions of security must continually return to these literally apocalyptic scenarios. And, you know, again, we don't have time to play this song, but click on this link at some point for those of you that don't know the song and listen to this extraordinary lyrics. I'm not going to go through all of them. The Eastern world, it is exploding, refers to Vietnam, Cambodia, the outlying regions of Laos, Thailand, and so forth. And if we think this has nothing to do with academic life, we're wrong. Because academics were directly engaged covertly within the context of this conflict. If you read the book, classic work in anthropology, Anthropology Goes to War, the problem of the Vietnam War raised the issue of what I and my colleague from US military intelligence have identified of academic engagement in questions of security. At peace education, I think we need to be aware of what is our stance here in relation to the state. So this is a context. There are some very, very powerful lines in this. You're old enough to kill, but not for voting. It's a popular song, but popular media, as today, as was then, directly influences popular opinion so much and societal attitudes. You don't believe in war, but what's that gun you're toting? And listen to this for those in the Middle East. And even the Jordan River has bodies floating. Things have not really dramatically changed today.
Liam, we've got 2 more minutes.
I've got my timer on. I've got 2:52, I believe, here.
We are on the same page.
Same page. The final verse of this song, think of all the hate there is in Red China. Take a look around to Selma, Alabama. You can look to Alabama and the southern states, but you can look all across the United States today with the Black Lives Matter movement. And this line I love, you may leave here, the atomic age is also the space age. You may leave here for 4 days in space, but when you return, it's the same old place. The problem, I argue, is always existential. Now, this has been identified long before all of the ages that I spoke about this out of fashion political thinker, but this famous science fiction writer in the 1920s wrote a famous series of work in the 1920s on history of the world. And he identified that human history is held between education and catastrophe. That was in the 1920s. And we know what came forth there. Second World War, the Holocaust, etc. So I identify in my work as something about what I call the existential art of education and the tasks of university research. And I identify 4 particular domains, which you can skip over: the operational, epistemological, the ethical, and the existential. I detail this at some length, and I detail in these couple of slides the meaning of each of these. But the most important one for the purposes of this short presentation, is the existential domain. That this interface between, in my area of work, universities and the security and intelligence, is that how to address these existential threats. And so again, just to close, if we wanted to look at the specific, and I detail in more academic depth, the specific scholars in peace education, peace studies, and security and intelligence studies in this paper called the University Security Intelligence Nexus. But universities at the heart of all this, and to my mind, it is a major responsibility. Okay, so I think we can draw a close here, just with one sentence, this particular slide, just to say that the cultural and the religious, as well as political histories, are important in addressing these seemingly intractable conflicts. And to note, as we all do note in our own work, all of us, that religion is becoming ever increasingly enhanced component of both peace, education, and security. So I think that's right on the dot here.